I'm Samuel Bush, and I was born in Barnwell County in the city of Williston, South Carolina, in the Savannah River area. I grew up on a farm from day one up until today, and there was a lot of things that went on in between that time and now. And of course, farming operation has changed just as much as everything else in our community has changed.
I'm Quentin Giles, and I was born in Williston, South Carolina in 1928. I grew up in this area where we grew a tremendous amount of asparagus. My father grew asparagus on the farm when I was little.
Hey, my name is Reuben Odom. I was born in Barnwell County, and I'm one of the 6 boys in the family and 2 sisters. And my mother was named Daisy Odom, and my daddy was named Jim Odom.
I was born in 1935 in Blackville, what they call the old Reynolds farm. In the early 1900s, this consists of about 3,000 acres of land. They were planted usually in March, right after the frost. You usually broke the land and bedded the land and planted watermelons about maybe 5 foot apart in the drill and maybe 6, 7 foot wide from one row to the other. You planted 4 or 5 seed, hoping to get one good plant, and the rest was what we call hold up or pulled up by hand. But starting off with a good stand of watermelons was important. Usually you planted on new land. By new land, this term was used that you did not plant watermelons in the same place from one year to the next. Usually you rotated anywhere from 3 to 5 years. If you cleared up land, which I remember land being cleared up just to plant watermelons. Watermelons, you would strive to have them ripe by July the 4th. And the trucks and all would move in from, we said up north, would come down to buy watermelons. And also the trains would start leaving car boxes in Blackville on the side track. And you have to understand that Blackville was still a real progressive town. We had 2 railroad tracks coming in. We had the what we call the old Charleston Hamburg Railroad, and then we also had the railroad that came from I believe Savannah on up to Columbia. One of them was the Southern and the other, and I don't know the name right now, but anyhow they both had 2 long side tracks, and these side tracks, the car boxes were left on the side, and people would come to Blackville and wagons, and the mules would pull the wagon, and they would stop a lot of them in what we call the back lot in Blackville. Now the back lot was located right behind Main Street and off of Main Street, and it was just a big old lot with the stores surrounding it. They tied the mules up, and they would proceed to sell their watermelons on the wagons. Buyers would walk through and offer you so much per watermelon. A quarter was common for a watermelon, 50 cents. The mules were amazing animals. They would sit there tied all day. Some of them weren't tied, just standing there. And it was quite I thought, a tiring job to sit there all day and try to wait for buyers to come along and offer you a quarter for your watermelons. Also, they'd park along what we call Main Street in Barnwell. That street was considered running from east to west, right along where Miller's breadbasket is today. You would find wagons and mules there. In fact, if you go to Blackville now, there's a water trough with a pump that's still on Main Street, and your horses, your mules would get thirsty during the day, and they had places for you to carry mules and let them drink water, and then they'd go back to wherever they were parked. Mixed in all these mules was, of course, the new trucks, and particularly 2-ton trucks. These trucks could haul probably, I'm guessing, 300 to 400 watermelons. A beautiful sight to see a body on a truck 5 foot high, and it what we call hooped over with watermelons. In other words, the watermelons were rounded over the top, and one of the prettiest sights you'll ever see in agriculture. But a lot of them were shipped by car box loads, and that was another experience to see. Those car boxes had 6 inches of straw, and it took a lot of straw to put into those car boxes to make a soft bed for watermelons to lay on. And particularly, it was right rough shipping by rail because the trains would jerk and stop and whatnot. So they had to be what we call packed. And people would get paid extra for packing a car box load of watermelons. A lot of times they'd put straw between the watermelons, so they stacked them up, and then usually stack them up about 3 or 4 foot high in the car box. The doors would have to be, wood would have to be put in the doors to keep the watermelons from rolling out, and that was another task.
At that time, they thinned the watermelons out when they started to bear, and the watermelons at that time, large watermelons was what we was primarily interested in growing. So if you had watermelons weighing 20 to 30 pounds, they was culled off and thrown in the hog pen. You wanted watermelons from 40 to 60 pounds, but it was not unusual to have watermelons weighing 80 pounds back in those days. All of this was a hands-on type situation where you used a lot of young people back in then, and of course everybody worked back in those days. So when you got ready to pick watermelons or cantaloupes or cucumbers, then you had the whole family out in the field gathering those things, and then the father was no doubt the one that carried them to the market. The rest of the family was getting another load ready to go to the market when he got back.
The cantaloupe was an interesting commodity. It was planted in rows about 3.5 feet wide and about 2.5 feet in the drill. Now they were bedded up, but only after they went to the barn and got manure out of the barns and carried them and carried the manure out in the field and scattered it up and down the row in what we call the drill. It was a fur made in the ground, and you put the manure with pitchforks in the ground, and then you would bed it up, make a bed, and plant the cantaloupes on the bed. Now these beds were made high, and then they were what we call blocked off or made smooth on top. 2 reasons for this. One, be sure there wasn't any grass, weeds, and number 2, it caused the bed to have moisture, so it would bring the cantaloupe seed up quicker. Those cantaloupe seeds were planted again in bunches of 3 or 4, and usually they were holed out to leave one cantaloupe bush. You had maybe, I'd say, 20 cantaloupes on a vine. Now,
all of our crops at that time were gathered by hand. If a person was picking the cotton, that he took this day to plant an acre. Now he's take another day to cultivate that acre. He's got to chop that cotton out. He's got to go on there with a 5-inch hoe and chop thin the cotton out. He didn't plant it where he wanted it. He planted it because at that time we didn't have germination on seed, so you didn't know what kind of condition your seed was in. So you planted much more than you needed, and then come back along and thinned out, what they call thinning out that you didn't need, and you left that for production. And when that cotton produced, you picked it by hand. The average person could pick from 100 to 300 pounds of cotton per acre. If you was a good cotton picker, you could pick 300 pounds an acre. And it just so happened that back in our day, our daddy's mother had taught us to pick 300 pounds an acre. 300 pounds a day. So that my brother and I and my younger sister, we could pick a bale of cotton every 2 days. And of course there was a lot of people being hired to pick cotton for other people at that time, the same as people are being hired to do things for other people today. At that time, if you pick cotton for somebody and if you picked 100 pounds of cotton in a day, and that means from before sun up until after sundown, then you got paid $1, or you got paid 1 penny for each pound of cotton you picked. Later in the cotton picking years, and that was up as late as the 50s, 1950, and in that time period, you was getting about 2 cents a pound for the cotton you picked. And of course, personally, I could pick 300 pounds of cotton, so I could make $6 a day, which was a lot of money back in those days.
And I went out there to pick cotton, and I could do pretty good, but I had a colored fellow on the place that said that he could pick 200 or better. I said, well, Landy, I think, Green, I think was his name, and so one day I said, well, Landy, I'm gonna pick what you picked this time. He said, well, you had to follow me. So we got out there and we started picking in that morning, and dinner time come. He went to get his dinner and I went to get mine, and when I went back, I went back before he did because I wanted to be sure I could get 200 pounds. Well, I did get 200 pounds of cotton on the sheet. We put it on the sheet, even if it was over, we tied it up and weighed it up and weighed it and carried it to the barn and put it in the barn, spread it out on the floor and all. And we sprayed cotton with a wheel with a chemical, syrup and other kind of chemical. I forgot the chemicals, but we put it in that syrup, and it would get down in the 2 hangovers. It would take 2 rows at a time, and had a cloth hanging down, and that syrup would go around and get in those cloth, and as the wheels would turn, that would turn into cotton and keep the wool wheels out.
Now, the gin business was unusual in the fact that you loaded your cotton, usually on a wagon, and usually put 1 bale. You'd fill up the wagon to the body about 2 foot high, and then you'd put sheets of cotton on top of it. Probably it'd take at least 4 sheets of cotton to make you a bale of cotton. You'd carry it to the gin. It would sometime, I've known people to stay 3 and 4 days to get cotton gin. Be long lines of cotton mules and wagons waiting to gin. Up at Elko they had a gin, and it's located about 2 miles from my home, and I remember this late fall, in the fall, you'd hear the gin run, it would make a popping sound 2 or 3 miles away. And that was always a sweet sound. We knew the cotton was coming out in the field and people was going to get a little bit of money. So that made us happy in the fall. People were really happy when they heard the gins crank up. It was just a different atmosphere than today.
The climate in the sandy soil in South Carolina was ideal for growing asparagus. A big plus with it, and it was advertised as such, it was grown in the iodine section of South Carolina. There's 2 months in the spring, Williston and the surrounding area was busy cutting, packing, and shipping asparagus to all places in the world.
I had asparagus, and my uncle did too. I farmed asparagus way back there. And the way they did the asparagus, they got crowns. Crowns that had roots to them, and a little old crown, and then the roots sprangled off, and they'd take those crowns and they go back to the field and lay off the rows and part the dirt, and then put the crowns in on the ground in that fur, and then they would take and cover them back up with dirt, and it'd be about 2 years before they would really get a good cutting off of it. And it grew up, and they just leave it there the first year, I think, and all. Then when they get ready to do something, they go in there and cut shallow. Don't move the crown, but cut that dirt back off of the asparagus that was planted, and they leave that there. And they also planted corn between the asparagus rows. They make 2 crops off that land. And but then the next year they'd put fertilizer down, or compost really, from the mule pens. They'd broadcast the compost and cover it back up. And that'd make the asparagus grow good. They'd go back in the wagons and all, and they'd take this here knife here. The beds would be rounded off like that, and they'd take this knife, holding it in my hand, and go right down by the asparagus, right on down, say about that deep. Can you get that? Mm-hmm. And they'd prise that asparagus, and you hear it pop. And then you take it and put it in. You had baskets to put that asparagus in with handles to it, and had baskets there. And then they would, when they fill up, they'd carry it to the end of the row and pile it in piles until they got that field cut. Then they'd come with the wagons, and they'd load that on the wagons and bring it to the shed. And they put it on the tables, and they had open it up like that. Then they put the asparagus in there like this and stack it around like that, and then they close the lid back down and clamp it down tight. Then they take this in a knife I'm holding in my hands, got ribs on it. And they take that knife and they'd cut that end of the asparagus off. A beautiful bunch of asparagus, and they put about 12, 14 or something like that in a homemade crates, asparagus crates. And before they cut it off though, they'd take this here thread here. This is asparagus thread that they would unravel this in, twist it around the asparagus like that, and then they'd cut it off, and naturally it couldn't come loose, you know. The first when they had that, they had T-model Fords, and they didn't have no trailers, didn't have no little old trailers pulled behind cars. And they had T-model Ford, and they put them crates, baskets of crates about that high, and they stick it, they lay it on the running board and the fenders of the T-model Fords, and they'd carry it down to Barnwell and put it on a train and carry it to places up in Philadelphia and stuff. They'd set it, they'd send the check back to the farmers.
Cucumbers came in a few weeks earlier. They were picked in the field and put in crates, and we still see some of those crates around today. You would pack what we call #1 cucumbers in the crates, and you'd carry them to Barnwell, and believe it or not, they were handled a little differently. We had a shed, what we call a shed in Blackville. A platform, and then that was about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. The shed was built up a little higher, and you drive under both sides of the shed, and they would auction off your cucumbers.
And sweet potatoes, I would get my sprouts from potatoes, and we put a bed down and put a lot of sweet potatoes on the bed, cover them up with dirt, and then they'd sprout up, and we pull up the little plants, and we go out in the field and with a stick and punch them down in the ground and pat dirt around them, and that's the way I planted them on the bed. So I didn't plant many sweet potatoes the year I was married, but after we would dig them, you'd have a middle buster, and we'd cut the vines off the potato ground on the bed that was planted on the bed. We'd cut the vines off, and then I'd have a middle buster with a blade on the stalk that would cut the roots and stuff and part the potatoes out, and then we'd dig them up. And what I wanted to keep, I'd put them in a bank, made a bank on the ground, hole in the ground, and put pine straw in there and put potatoes in that, and then cover them up with pine straw and then put dirt on that. Because I had sticks around to kind of hold the dirt off of them where we could get in and get them.
Farming in the 40s and 50s, their cash crops was mainly in this area was cotton, corn, peanuts, watermelons, cantaloupes, cucumbers, and asparagus. Peas, butter beans, and cabbage, okra, and sweet potatoes, iced potatoes, turnips, collards, were the vegetables that each individual family grew to support their particular family. The ground was prepared with a mule and a plow, and it is what we would term as a one-horse farm and a two-horse farm. A one-horse farm meant that the person that was farming was the man and his wife and his children, possibly 1 or 2 children. And that the plow that he used to initially prepare his ground was a 6-inch turn plow, and he could turn possibly an acre a day, provided he started before sun up and continued with the lunch hour until sundown. A two-horse farm consists of the same man under the same set of conditions but he was able to buy 2 mules instead of 1. And he could use a 10-inch plow, and he could probably do about 2 acres a day. And of course he had to knock off at 12, carry his mule home and feed his mule, and his mule had to eat. And of course while his mule was eating, then the man went in the house and he had dinner and maybe took a nap, and he did all this within an hour's time. In 1 hour's time, he was ready to go back to the field and start plowing again. He started in January turning his land for cotton, and he would plant his cotton in March, which is a little bit earlier than what we plant cotton now. But back in those days, the weather conditions was different from what it is now. Corn was planted in 5-foot wide rows, and if he had if he's running a 1-horse farm, he could take what we call a start plow and use a 10-inch shovel and open the furrow. Then he'd have to come back with that same mule and same man in that same row if he put out fertilizer, but most of the time we didn't put out fertilizer on corn. You had to come back and spend that same amount of time to plant that corn with one planter. So it would take you another day to get that corn planted. And he also planted watermelons. I might add that the corn was planted in 5-foot rows. In other words, the rows were 5 feet apart. He could drive his wagon right down the middle of the row, break the corn from, if he and his wife was out there, one could break one row and the other one break the other row and throw it on the wagon.
The time it come to corn, we'd get out and plant corn about middle of March or something like that. And then when it grow up and make corn and time to gather it and all, we'd a lot of times we'd pull the fodder, the blades on that corn stalk, and we'd feed that fodder to mules and corn also. And but then after we'd feed our hogs with corn and feed our mules with corn. We'd fill our barn slam full of corn. I remember Uncle Albert up here had that big barn out in the back of the house here, slam full of corn from the back to the front and throw it up in the josses up there, just packed full of corn in the air.
A lot of people made a lot of money and a good living from the cantaloupe market. A lot of it was sharecrop market. Sharecrop meant that the tenant did the farming, the farm owner, he furnished the fertilizer and the seed and furnished everything but the labor, and it worked out to be a good relationship with everybody. It was fun days in those days, although it was a lot of hard work.